When Jean-Paul Sartre becomes a public figure, something changes in the structure of responsibility itself. Sartre does not treat visibility as recognition earned or authority granted. He treats it as exposure, a condition that makes evasion more difficult and compromise more tempting. Sartre's celebrity was not accidental, nor was it embraced innocently. He understood early that to be widely heard is already to exercise power, whether one wishes to or not. The question then was never whether he should become visible, but how responsibility changes once one is. Sartre rejects the romantic idea of the famous intellectual as a voice above society. Fame does not lift one out of power relations. It embeds one more deeply within them. The more one is listened to, the greater the risk that one's words replace thinking rather than provoke it. This is the central danger Sartre recognizes. To be quoted, summarized, and simplified is not neutral. Public attention transforms ideas into symbols. Symbols circulate faster than arguments. They detach from context. Sartre understands that once this happens, intellectual work risks becoming spectacle. Spectacle is dangerous because it invites identification rather than judgment. People begin to repeat positions because Sartre holds them, not because they have been examined. Sartre treats this as a failure, not of the audience alone, but of the intellectual who allows their persona to replace their reasoning. This is why Sartre repeatedly refuses institutional honors, including the Nobel Prize. These refusals are not gestures of purity. They are attempts to resist symbolic authority. Sartre believes honors convert visibility into legitimacy and legitimacy into insulation. Insulation is what he fears most. The public intellectual, once insulated, no longer feels the consequences of their words. Statements become declarations. Declarations become positions. Positions become identity. At that point, responsibility collapses into role. Sartre refuses this collapse. He insists that visibility does not absolve error, it magnifies it. To speak publicly is to intervene in situations one cannot fully control. Words will be taken up, distorted, weaponized, or misunderstood. Sartre does not believe this risk can be eliminated. He believes it must be owned. This ownership transforms how speech functions. Sartre does not treat public speech as commentary. He treats it as action. To speak publicly is to act in the world, not merely describe it. Every statement participates in power relations, whether the speaker acknowledges it or not. This is why Sartre rejects the idea that the public intellectual should be balanced or objective in the journalistic sense. Balance often conceals asymmetry. When power is unequal, neutral framing reproduces inequality. Sartre insists that clarity requires taking sides, not because one is righteous, but because silence already sides with power. This insistence places Sartre in constant conflict with institutions that prefer experts who explain without judging. Sartre refuses this role. He insists that explanation without consequence is another form of evasion. Celebrity intensifies this conflict. The more famous Sartre becomes, the more pressure he faces to simplify, moderate, or stabilize his positions. Media demands clarity, brevity, and recognizable stances. Sartre recognizes that these demands are hostile to philosophy. Philosophy resists slogans. Celebrity produces them. Sartre therefore treats celebrity as a threat to intellectual seriousness. He does not believe one can escape this threat. One can only resist it imperfectly. This resistance explains why Sartre often appears contradictory, volatile, or overstated in public. He is struggling against reduction. Reduction is what turns thinking into branding. Once a thinker becomes a brand, disagreement becomes scandal rather than argument. Sartre refuses to protect himself from scandal. He believes protection produces dishonesty. To remain serious, one must remain exposed. Exposure, however, is exhausting. Sartre does not pretend that living as a public intellectual is sustainable or clean. It produces distortion, misinterpretation, and backlash. It also produces temptation, the temptation to speak because one is expected to, rather than because one has something to say. Sartre is acutely aware of this temptation. He knows that silence, once one is famous, is interpreted politically. To say nothing is no longer neutral. Silence becomes a statement. This transforms restraint into risk. The public intellectual cannot retreat into privacy without consequence. Withdrawal may protect the self, but it abandons responsibility. Sartre believes that once one is visible, one cannot pretend to be merely private again. Visibility changes the ethical landscape permanently. This is why Sartre does not romanticize celebrity as opportunity. He treats it as burden. Fame does not grant moral authority. It imposes obligation. The more one is heard, the more carefully one must speak, not because one is correct, but because one's errors travel further. At the same time, Sartre rejects the idea that public intellectuals should restrict themselves to their area of expertise. Expertise is itself a form of power. To refuse to speak on injustice because one is not authorized is another way of preserving comfort. Sartre insists that responsibility does not wait for credentials. This insistence makes him a controversial figure. He is accused of overreach, moralizing, and opportunism. Sartre accepts these accusations as part of exposure. He believes that avoiding them would require withdrawing into safety, and safety for Sartre is always suspect. At this stage, Sartre's position should be clear. Celebrity does not legitimize speech. It intensifies its consequences. Visibility does not grant authority. It magnifies responsibility. The public intellectual is not elevated. They are exposed. But this exposure raises a deeper problem. If celebrity transforms the intellectual into a symbol, then how does one resist becoming a substitute for thinking itself? How does one speak publicly without turning into an oracle, a brand, or a moral shortcut? Sartre is aware that this danger cannot be eliminated. If celebrity transforms the intellectual into a symbol, then Sartre must confront a problem with no clean solution. How does one speak publicly without becoming a substitute for thinking itself? Once a philosopher becomes recognizable, quotable, and expected to speak, their presence risks replacing argument with authority. Sartre recognizes this danger clearly, and he does not believe it can be eliminated. The public intellectual, once visible, becomes a shortcut. People no longer ask what is being argued, but who is speaking. Agreement becomes identification. Disagreement becomes rejection of the person, rather than engagement with the idea. Sartre sees this as a corruption of intellectual life. Yet withdrawal is not an answer. Sartre rejects the idea that the intellectual can simply step back and preserve purity. Silence, once one is famous, is no longer neutral. It is interpreted as endorsement, evasion, or abandonment. The public intellectual does not get to opt out of meaning. Visibility, once acquired, cannot be undone. This is why Sartre's life as a public figure appears restless, erratic, and often contradictory. He refuses to stabilize his image. He changes positions. He revises judgments. He aligns and realigns. This is not inconsistency for its own sake. It is resistance to becoming fixed. Fixity is what turns the intellectual into an institution. Sartre understands that once one becomes predictable, one becomes manageable. Media, parties, and movements prefer stable figures who can be quoted reliably. Sartre resists this by remaining difficult, even at the cost of credibility. He would rather be accused of confusion than become a monument. This resistance explains why Sartre often speaks in ways that provoke discomfort rather than consensus. He does not seek to unify audiences. He seeks to disrupt complacency. Celebrity, when used carefully, can force issues into visibility that power would prefer to ignore. But this use is always compromised. The more Sartre intervenes publicly, the more his persona overshadows his arguments. His name becomes a rallying point, both for supporters and critics. Sartre recognizes that his presence distorts the field in which he speaks. He does not deny this distortion. He attempts to work within it. This is why Sartre insists repeatedly that the public intellectual must refuse the role of moral authority. He does not claim to speak for others. He claims only to speak from a position that is itself implicated. This implication matters. When Sartre speaks on political struggles, he does not present himself as judge. He presents himself as participant, one whose words may do harm as well as good. This acknowledgement does not excuse error. It intensifies responsibility. Responsibility here means refusing the safety of distance. Sartre is aware that celebrity tempts the intellectual to perform rather than think. Public expectation rewards clarity, confidence, and decisiveness. Doubt, hesitation, and revision are interpreted as weakness. Sartre refuses this economy. He insists that thinking must remain visible as thinking, unfinished, risky, and exposed. This refusal is costly. Sartre's public interventions often attract hostility, ridicule, and misinterpretation. He is accused of naivety, extremism, and moral arrogance. Sartre does not treat these accusations as evidence that he should retreat. He treats them as the price of exposure. At the same time, Sartre never claims that exposure guarantees correctness. He knows that public intellectuals can do damage. Words can inflame, simplify, and polarize. Sartre's own record is not free of error. What matters for Sartre is not purity, but answerability. To be answerable is to remain open to criticism, revision, and reassessment. It is to refuse the comfort of being right once and for all. Celebrity pushes in the opposite direction. It rewards certainty and punishes revision. Sartre resists by refusing finality. This resistance becomes especially important when intellectual celebrity merges with political movements. Movements often seek figureheads. Figureheads simplify complexity. Sartre resists becoming a spokesperson precisely because spokespersons convert critique into endorsement. He insists that alignment does not eliminate judgment. This insistence frustrates allies as much as opponents. Sartre does not offer reliable loyalty. He offers conditional engagement. This makes him difficult to use and therefore difficult to absorb into power. But it also leaves him exposed. The public intellectual, in Sartre's view, occupies a permanently unstable position, too visible to retreat, too critical to be absorbed, too implicated to claim innocence, too recognizable to speak without consequence. There is no stable equilibrium here. Sartre does not present this instability as a virtue. He presents it as a condition one must endure if one accepts visibility. Fame does not offer a higher platform, it removes shelter. This is why Sartre treats the intellectual's life as a series of renewed decisions rather than a settled role. One must repeatedly ask, why am I speaking now? What will this do? Who will this serve? These questions have no final answers. Sartre rejects the comforting idea that the public intellectual can eventually get it right and rest. There is no point at which one's visibility becomes ethically safe. Responsibility renews itself with every intervention. This is the modernity of Sartre's dilemma. In a world saturated with media, amplification, and spectacle, intellectual celebrity spreads faster than argument. Sartre anticipates this condition. He sees that visibility accelerates distortion. He insists that this acceleration does not excuse silence. It makes seriousness harder, not optional. By the end of this analysis, Sartre's position should be unmistakable. The public intellectual cannot escape power. They cannot purify influence. They cannot control reception. They can only refuse exemption. Celebrity does not elevate the thinker. It exposes them to consequence without refuge. Sartre does not solve the problem of intellectual celebrity. He inhabits it. imperfectly, visibly, and without apology. He refuses to become a symbol that thinks on behalf of others. Instead, he insists on remaining a thinker who speaks at risk. That risk is not heroic, it is not noble, it is unavoidable. And that is why Sartre treats public visibility not as success, but as responsibility intensified, a burden one accepts or refuses without innocence either way.